It's pretty easy when looking at the past to lose a sense of time and space. A whole century and a whole continent can be easily homogenized in our minds, while sections of the world can be taken in complete isolation, leading one to forget or be completely unaware of everything else taking place at the same time. And yet, people in those days acted and lived within a world which was just as complex and nuanced as our own. Every year had its triumphs and its tragedies, and those would ultimately shape the world of today, whether overtly or subtly. For this reason, I've decided to start a series which will explore events and places in the 1020s, 1,000 years ago. My hope is that it will not only be entertaining, but it will also help whoever watches it have a more nuanced and complex understanding of history, which can often feel distant and blurry at times. So, without further ado, let's start off with an area which many people will be more familiar with, though perhaps at a time that they might not be: England in the 1020s. There's a tendency when talking about medieval England to begin in 1066, when William of Normandy came to the throne after his conquest of England. And this is for a couple of reasons, including the fact that it marked an important shift in England's history, which was drawn into later narratives as the beginning of what they deemed important, including eventually being seen as the genesis of Englishness. After all, the influx of French vocabulary at this point has had a huge impact on the modern English language. That being said, England and the English existed in some form before this point as well, in what historians call the Anglo-Saxon period. Popular interest in the Anglo-Saxons has grown in the past few decades due to the increased popularity of Vikings, but this, of course, is a narrow lens through which to see them. So, first off in our discussion, let's start with some background. The Anglo-Saxons get their name from the fact that they originated from Germanic tribes on the continent, around modern Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, called the Angles and the Saxons, though there were also some Jutes and Frisians in there as well. According to the traditional narrative, after Rome's armies left Britain in the late 4th or early 5th centuries, local Romano-British rulers arose, fighting each other as well as external enemies like the Picts in modern Scotland, and they hired mercenaries from these Germanic tribes. These mercenaries eventually came to dominate the land and establish kingdoms of their own, over time seeing each other as a single people, usually referred to in Latin as the Angli, though in some other languages, especially Celtic ones, they were referred to with names derived from the term Saxon, such as the Scottish Gaelic term Sassenach, which is probably known by most people thanks to the TV show Outlander. Ultimately, the modern term English comes from the Angles. For a long time, the land of the Angles was divided into several kingdoms, but alliances, conquests, and hegemony under the Kingdom of Wessex in the 9th and 10th centuries, largely to fight against Viking invasions, meant that by the 1020s the English realms had been largely united for almost a century. But in the 1020s, the King of the English, the Rex Anglorum, was not himself English. Rather, the king was a Dane named Knut, later known as Cnut the Great, who ruled both England and Denmark, and after 1028 would also rule Norway, in what historians call the North Sea Empire. I'm personally not a huge fan of this term, as it implies more centrality than actually existed, but I guess the three kingdoms of the North Sea doesn't roll off the tongue nearly as nicely. Maybe a case can be made for the North Sea overlordship or the North Sea hegemony, but anyway, it doesn't really matter, so let's move on. So, how did Knut, a Dane, come to be King of England? Well, it really goes back all the way to the Viking Age conquests of parts of England in the 9th century, which began a long period of interaction between Scandinavians and the British Isles. More immediately, one can look to the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002, in which King Athelred ordered the killing of Danes in England, of which there were many due to the past invasions resulting in permanent Scandinavian settlements in England. This was in response to a perceived threat upon Ethelred's life, and the renewal of Danish raids in England. Now, it should be noted right off the bat here that the term Dane was often used for Scandinavians in general, so it's not always possible to make distinctions. But regardless, in this case, the King of Denmark at the time, Sven Forkbeard, was not happy, and he used this as a justification to conduct his own raids on England and eventually invade, at least according to some accounts. Of course, all of this is a major oversimplification of events, and like I said, these interactions are based on centuries of history up to this point. The motives of both Ethelred and Svein Forkbeard are likely much more complex than I could ever really present them in any video, but the bottom line is that Svein invaded England in 1013, forcing Ethelred to flee and established himself as its king. But Svein died in 1014, and Knut, who had traveled to England as a part of his father's army, was forced to retreat as Ethelred managed to take back the throne. While Knut's brother Harald became king of Denmark, with Knut possibly becoming co-monarch, it's not entirely clear, Knut eventually decided to retake England as successor to his father, and, with an army largely made up of mercenaries from around Scandinavia, he conquered England for good in 1016, remaining its king up until his death in 1035. By around 1019, Harald had also died, and Knut was invited to Denmark to succeed as king there as well. But back to England. Although it was a single kingdom in the 1020s, England was still largely divided into four main parts, roughly corresponding to historical kingdoms and their dominions. There was Wessex in the south, which also included places like Kent, Mercia in the west, the Danelaw in the east, which included London, and Northumbria in the north. Although the term Danelaw is often used today in reference to the Viking realms in England from the 9th century, it's actually first attested under Knut, and was a region in which Danish law and custom prevailed, in part due to the large Danish population already present, as it corresponded roughly to the areas of these Viking realms. Each of these regions were largely ruled by one or more aldermen, though this term was increasingly being replaced by the term earl, from the Norse jarl, but at this point they were both being used, and they were mostly interchangeable. The alderman, or earl, was appointed by the king to head a local council of justice and administration, which included the region's thanes, essentially the landholding elites. Oftentimes, the alderman was the most powerful thane in the area, or had some sort of special relationship with the king. In theory, the title was not hereditary, though it often passed from father to son. The church also had an important part to play, both spiritually but also administratively, and especially legally. Each shire would have had one or more bishops or abbots, who themselves would have been important holders of lands. The most important members of the clergy in England were the archbishops of Canterbury and York, from whom all other English bishops obtained their authority, at least in theory. This structure had come about from a long process of centralization, especially in the 10th century, of these several kingdoms merging into one, allowing for the king to hold a strong position in which he delegated authority to several magnates, separating him from the mundane world of local affairs and elevating his character to something beyond simply a more powerful aristocrat. Knut, therefore, relied upon and continued the work of his predecessors in order to keep his kingdom together and uphold his authority. In many ways, he was an English king. Nonetheless, he was well aware that his position as a conqueror was tenuous, and after most of his mercenaries were paid off and returned home in 1018, he couldn't simply rely on force to rule. Nor was he under any illusion that strength alone could keep him in power. He had to make sure that those in power were loyal to him, and a conqueror's best friends are properly rewarded allies. Land and titles were taken from those who resisted him fiercely and given to those Danes which remained with him in England, and those English nobles who supported him during the conflicts and after. He granted land strategically in order to ensure that he had a presence of loyal men where he most needed them, and he ensured that earldoms were held by those he could trust, which meant that there was a minority of Danes who were often the most powerful members of his court, though there were plenty of powerful Englishmen as well. Despite the departure of most of his invasion force, however, Knut did keep a military presence in a couple of places, namely East Anglia and London. Although not yet the booming capital they would eventually become, London had been gradually growing in power for several centuries as a center of commerce and artisanal production. It was also a place, along with East Anglia, where Ethelred and his son Edmund Ironside had had strong support, having to be besieged during Knut's campaign in 1016. For this reason, Knut established a permanent fleet garrisoned on the Thames called the Lithsmen to ensure the city's loyalty, and they would remain important players in London politics throughout his reign and beyond. He also made grants to several churches and interfered in the selection of bishops and abbots, which was hardly unusual for an early medieval monarch. Throughout the 1020s, he was close to both archbishops, with the Archbishop of Canterbury essentially acting as the Alderman of Kent. This was valuable both due to the secular power of the church, but also for ideological reasons as well. Archbishop Wulfstan of York, who held that position until his death in 1023, had given a famous sermon in the 1010s decrying the state of England and blaming the chaos and constant destruction, strife, and death on the sinfulness of the English people and their kings. However, Knut's promises and ability to bring lasting peace to the kingdom, especially putting an end to Viking raids, prompted the archbishop to praise the king and support his rule publicly until the former's death, after which Knut ensured that a man of similar loyalty would succeed to the office. For all of Knut's success, however, his authority resided largely in the south. Since its conquest and incorporation into the kingdom in the 920s, Northumbria had always had a great deal of autonomy within the kingdom, with the King of England largely acting as a distant overlord. Knut did have some sway through his connection to the Archbishop of York, but politically speaking, this was quite small, and the earls, especially those of the north based in Bamborough, largely ruled on their own. Knut would appear to start trying to change this in the 1030s, but for now he largely let it be. All of this meant that Knut's reign was fairly stable by the 1020s, although he did experience some issues. In 1020, he outlawed an English alderman named Athelweird, possibly due to an attempted rebellion, though we don't actually have any details about it. In 1021, he did the same for a Dane, Thorkel the Tall, who had been the dominant earl of the Danelaw region. Thorkel's situation had always been more one of concession rather than bonds of loyalty, though, as he'd been a successful raider in England before Svein Forkbeard's initial invasion, and Knut and his father owed a part of their success to his actions. Thorkel ultimately escaped to Denmark, where he and Knut made peace in 1023, and Knut placed him as a sort of regent of Denmark and guardian of his son Harthacnut, only 5 years old at the time. Unfortunately for Thorkel, though, this didn't last very long, and he was soon killed and replaced by someone else. Speaking of Denmark, although this video is focused primarily on England, Knut's second kingdom deserves some mention here. Compared to England, Denmark was unstable and hard to control, with local lords having much more autonomy and power than their English counterparts. England was Knut's seat of power, and he likely would have preferred a strong alliance with his brother Harold than to rule over Denmark directly. Indeed, for much of the 1020s, Knut ruled from England and relied on ministers and what might essentially be called viceroys or regents to administer Denmark. However, his attention was drawn away from England in 1026, when a rebellion arose composed of several Danish elites, supported by King Olaf Haraldsson of Norway and Anund Jakob of Sweden. He defeated them before traveling to Rome for the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II in 1027, after which he returned to Denmark to strengthen his hold and finally deal with those who had rebelled. He came back to England briefly in 1028 before leaving again as Olaf of Norway began to suffer due to internal strife, and many nobles turned to Knut to replace him, which he did, staying in Norway for some time and placing his nephew Hakon in charge before finally returning to England once again in 1029. All of this is to say that in the latter half of the 1020s, Knut spent most of his time away from England, and it was the strong, central nature of English kingship and his efforts to establish his authority up to that point which allowed for his grip to remain on his kingdom despite this prolonged absence. It was also after this time in mainland Europe and Scandinavia that Knut would start to take on a more imperialistic view of his role as King of England, following in a growing trend by English kings, starting really in the 940s with Edmund I, of seeing themselves as overlords of the entirety of the British Isles, as well as the growing jockeying of power between Denmark, Sweden, and Norway for the same thing in Scandinavia. By the end of the 1020s, Knut was certainly the overlord of Scandinavia, though not quite yet of Britain. And with that, the 1020s conclude with Knut still on the English throne in a stable position, and 2 more thrones ruled by him through his regents. If you want to see more history of the world 1,000 years ago, or would like to learn about any number of other topics related to history, I encourage you to like this video and to subscribe to my channel. I thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.